Thank you for viewing this innovation vlog brought to you by the Prosecutors Center for Excellence and Equitas. My name is Sophia Roach, and I'm a senior prosecutor for the Prosecutors Center for Excellence. And I am joined by the Platte County prosecuting attorney, Eric Zahnd, and we're going to be hearing about his innovative approach to addressing post-trial trauma for jurors, especially in serious cases. Eric Zahnd is the elected prosecutor in Platte County. After graduating from law school at Duke, he began his career in business litigation. He was first elected to the Platte County prosecuting attorney position in 2002. He has supported many innovations, including advocating for statewide best practices and creating Platte Cares, a diversion program that delivers restorative and educational services to first-time nonviolent offenders. Mr. Zahnd is a past president of the Missouri Association of Prosecuting Attorneys and is a member of the board of directors of the National District Attorneys Association, where he serves on the executive committee. So we'd like to welcome you. Thank you.
Sophie, it's so good to be with you. I've learned so much from Prosecutors Center for Excellence over the years, and it's great to share a really simple idea that we had here in Platte County.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Could you tell us a little bit about your office and the nature of the trial that you were handling that led you to think about jury trauma?
Sure. Platte County is part of the suburban Kansas City area. In fact, half of our residents live in the city of Kansas City. The city of Kansas City spreads out over 4 different counties in Missouri. Our county is about 110,000 people, stretching again from suburban Kansas City all the way into rural areas. I've got 12 assistant prosecutors and 13 other staff people, and we handle cases ranging from speeding cases all the way to first-degree murder. I've tried many of our murder cases, not all of them, but continue to try cases as well as administer the office, and had a particularly gruesome murder case this last December where 4 people, including a 3-month-old baby, were shot in the head and then burned nearly beyond recognition. In all of the cases I've tried over 20 years, the pictures and the descriptions of what happened in this case, frankly, were the most difficult that I've ever dealt with. The 3-month-old baby was likely killed as he was essentially nursing the tip of the .22 firearm that had been placed near the corner of his mouth. So it was really difficult evidence. And difficult not only on the prosecution team, the 2 assistants who tried this case with me and myself, but I knew this was going to be really hard for jurors to listen to as well. And so that'll lead us to the really simple idea that we had in this case.
And what was that?
So, for years, we hadn't talked about secondary trauma even within prosecutors' offices. We've now done a better job of the prosecution community in recent years thinking about how trauma affects us as prosecutors. But to my knowledge, we had never thought about how it affects jurors who, in a trial like this, had to see many of the pictures. We tried as hard as we could to reduce the number of pictures the jurors had to see of this scene to the bare minimum, but they still saw pictures of the victims after they had been burned, and so it was going to be a tough case no matter what. And I thought, we've just got to do something for these jurors who are likely to be traumatized by what they saw, and we saw during the trial that in fact they were. In fact, several of the jurors looked away from the screen when we displayed the images. Many of them became emotional, both during the presentation of the evidence and also during closing arguments. And so even before we presented the case, I just thought we've got to do something. And so I reached out to a local mental health provider and asked their CEO whether they had somebody on staff who'd be willing to take phone calls from jurors. And as a result, we created a card that we handed to all the jurors. You might have a copy of that card, Sophia, that we can show folks. So this is the card, and we printed it on cardstock, and it, as you'll see, has a very simple message to jurors, thanking them first for their service. And we've had a practice in Platte County the entire 20 years that I've been the prosecuting attorney, where guilty verdict or not guilty verdict, we always try to meet jurors after the trial, shake their hands, and thank them for their service. In the past, we've just handed out business cards and invited them, if they wanted to talk more about the trial with any of us, that they could call us. We've replaced those business cards now with this small 3x5 card that just has a very simple message and then lists the name and phone number for the chief clinical offices of a local mental health services provider here in Platte County. That chief clinical office has shared her cell phone number and invited any juror to call her at any time.
Wow.
We're going to hold those calls as confidential. I may reach out to Tri-County Mental Health Services someday just to ask how many jurors have contacted them, but I'll never ask the identity of those jurors or what they talked about, because we do want people to be able to seek confidential help for any trauma that they experience during a trial. Because the other thing that I think sometimes we don't recognize as prosecutors when we've done this job for years is that not only can there be difficulty and trauma from the case itself, but oftentimes just making decisions that are going to impact somebody's life, literally take away somebody's freedom, decide who's credible and who's not. We as prosecutors deal with that on a daily basis, and we sort of get used to it. What we don't realize, I think, sometimes is that for normal people, people who go about their lives just not thinking about crime every day, these can be very difficult and stressful decisions. I've talked with jurors in the past in trials that haven't been particularly violent in nature, but just about how difficult the deliberations were and how seriously they took their job of deciding whether or not they were going to send somebody to prison for a crime that they may have committed. So all of that led me to think that there's a really simple solution for this, and we ought to offer the same sort of services that we are now offering internally to our prosecutors, to our jurors as well. So that's all we're doing. We've replaced our business cards with these cards with a very short message, handing them to jurors as we thank them for their service after a trial.
Did you have any discussions with the court or defense counsel prior to doing this? And if so, what was the outcome of that?
We did have discussions with the court, and I've continued to have discussions with our judges. At this point, our judges have not embraced the decision to hand out these cards themselves. I really think that a card like this coming from the court might even be more powerful than it coming from a prosecutor's office. But I don't think it's opposition from our judges. I think our judges are just really busy right now as we continue to come out from the post-COVID lull in jury trials and now are really overwhelmed by jury trials. I think our presiding judge just has so many things on his plate that he hasn't really been able to give this the time it deserves. But I decided we weren't going to be deterred by that we'll go ahead and do it ourselves in those conversations that, again, we've been having for many years with jurors after every single trial. So at this point in our office, we are doing this ourselves. We've not asked permission from defense attorneys. Again, we never asked permission to talk with jurors before. And many times defense attorneys are out there in the very hallway meeting with jurors at the same time we have. I've shared with them the card that we handed jurors. Defense attorneys have only said, I think that's a great idea. I'm so glad you're doing that. I don't know why we didn't think of this earlier, which is exactly the reaction that I had when I finally thought about it. I asked myself, gosh, I've been doing this for 20 years. Why didn't I think of this 20 years ago? But of course, at the time, none of us were talking about secondary trauma, not even with law enforcement officers, not even in our offices, and certainly not with jurors.
And since you've kind of deployed this outside of your own office, have you thought about any other segments of our kind of criminal justice system that might benefit from offering the same type of services?
We're doing a better job now in thinking about this. I think if we just go back, even 5 or certainly 10 years ago, we didn't think about secondary trauma at all. Our law enforcement partners, frankly, sort of beat us to this, and have been doing a better job with police officers and sheriff's deputies in addressing secondary trauma. Then we, as the prosecution community, began to pick it up. We've done a good job, I think, over the years addressing it with victims, but we also ought to be thinking about witnesses. We ought to continue to look and be aware of how trauma affects us internally as prosecutors and prosecutors' offices, but also look out for our law enforcement witnesses. I know this trial was difficult on everybody who participated in it, and I had conversations with my assistant prosecutors who prosecuted the case with me and with several of our law enforcement witnesses about how you doing? You doing okay? And this same clinical officer who agreed to take calls from jurors has agreed to take confidential calls from members of my office as well. And we've shared her number internally with assistant prosecutors and support staff. Again, I'm never going to ask specifically who has called, because we want to keep that confidential. But frankly, I hope if members of my office need that assistance, they can get it there. And then also that we're creating the sort of environment internally in our office where people feel good about sharing colleague to colleague as well, and supporting one another. We need to look out for ourselves. We need to look out for our colleagues, and then we need to look out for our victims, witnesses, and law enforcement partners as well.
One practical question I wanted to ask you is the chief clinical officer for this Tri-County Mental Health Services, is that like partially government funded or a government agency so that you're able to have kind of a more collaborative relationship with them?
They are partly governmentally funded, and we've had a relationship with them for a long time. They help service our 4 treatment courts in Platte County. We're fortunate to have drug treatment, DWI treatment, mental health treatment, and veterans treatment courts in Platte County. They service 3 of those 4 courts. The VA services our veterans courts. So we've had a long, fruitful relationship with Tri-County Mental Health Services. And I think because of their governmental funding, they are likely able to subsidize any of the requests they get for counseling with that sort of funding. And they also, folks who are able to pay, I'm sure they refer out to additional services as well. They've been a tremendous partner for us.
Is there any other advice or lessons learned from this endeavor that you can pass on to others who might be considering a similar type of program?
I guess, Sophia, I would just say this. This is a delightfully simple program. It's as long as you can find a provider who is willing to take these sorts of calls, it takes that, a piece of paper, and a little bit of time from somebody in your office to meet jurors, which you may be doing anyway. In our office, we were already doing that. So really the only investment was to come up with somebody who was willing to take these calls, and then to replace our business cards with these 3x5 cards to hand to folks. So it is probably the most simple innovation that I've ever implemented in our office. Again, I don't know why I didn't think of it earlier. Maybe other folks have been doing it for a long, long time. But if you're not and you can do it, I just think it's such a simple, but I think powerful thing to do. We as prosecutors are really missing an opportunity if we don't begin to provide this service to our jurors.
Well, thank you so much. We appreciate you sharing this innovation with us, and we'd like to thank our viewers as well. If you'd like to share an innovation with us, please contact PCE directly at contactpce@pceinc.org. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophia. Good to be with you today.